Hi everyone, welcome to 3G NY Stories Live WEDU Wednesday. My name is Dylan Horowitz. I'm a 3G NY board member and a grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors from Hungary. I'm thrilled to be here for our 5th WEDU Wednesday featuring our guest speaker Alexis Fishman. I'm actually in Tel Aviv right now and it's the middle of the night here, but 3G NY and Alexis are very important to me. So I'm happy to be a part of tonight's program. A little bit about us. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit organization for grandchildren of survivors. As a living link, we preserve the legacy and the lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate kids about the Holocaust and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. We were founded in 2005 by a group of 6 grandkids of survivors. Today, 3GNY membership exceeds 2,600 grandkids. Before COVID-19, we held diverse in-person programs, including museum tours, art programs, discussion groups, volunteering with survivors, Shabbat dinners, intergenerational gathering, and more. 3GNY has also helped launch other groups like 3G DC and 3G New Jersey. Our goal is hopefully to reach every state. We are now in full swing with virtual events and are proud to share our work with a wider audience. We are most proud of our flagship educational program, WEDU, which is short for We Educate. This initiative trains grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their family Holocaust experience to kids at schools and classrooms. WEDU is a powerful contribution to Holocaust education. As the population of survivors declines, their stories should not be lost with them. Now is the time to take responsibilities for those stories. As a living link to our grandparents' stories, we create a personal connection to history. The Holocaust serves as an instructive entry point for examining prejudice today. WEDU actively engages students to think about ways to confront intolerance. Our ability to share authentic stories allows us to connect with people from different backgrounds and levels of understanding. This creates dialogue and inspires students to explore their own family history as an entry point to understand the world's history. For WEDU, we have been collaborating partnership with the American Society of Yad Vashem Young Leadership Association Group. We are thankful for their support. Since WEDU started in 2010, we have trained 250 speakers, visited 270 classrooms in nearly 100 different schools, and have reached over 25,000 students. We are still going. Since COVID-19 hit, we have moved our WEDU training session for 3Gs onto a virtual program. We're now visiting classrooms via Zoom and when school is in session, and we're working with teachers to ensure we can still make an impact even if we cannot present in person right now. We have much more to do, and we are making it happen however we can. In order for us to keep doing this crucial work, your support is essential. 3G is a volunteer run and relies on donation to keep WEDU and many other programs going. Any amount, big and small, will help us sustain WEDU and train even more grandkids of survivors. For example, $300 sponsors a 3G to go through the WEDU program, and $3,600 can sponsor an entire WEDU class. There's a link to our donation page in the chat box, and we hope you'll consider making a gift. Thank you for helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and to ensure that never forget is more than just an empty phrase. I would like to hand it over to Lori Klugman, a 3G board member, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Dylan. Hi, I'm Lori Klugman, grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors, and I'm proud to introduce my friend Alexis Fishman tonight. Alexis is the grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors from Hungary and Czechoslovakia. She was born in Sydney, Australia, and has lived in New York since 2008. Shortly thereafter, she discovered 3GNY and was a proud member of the board and co-chair of the Education Committee from 2015 to 2019. Alexis is a prolific and talented actor and singer. She's recognized as one of Australia's leading ladies of musical theatre, performing there in major musicals and earning a Helpman nomination, Australia's Tony Award. Since moving to New York, she has continued to perform extensively off-Broadway and has also made a splash in cabaret, writing and producing 6 solo shows since 2014 that have earned critical acclaim and have toured both the US and Australia. Alexis is also a producer at Moira Blumenthal Productions, Australia's premier Jewish theater company, and is a Jewish educator for Lab Shul based in New York. I feel fortunate to have had the pleasure of seeing Alexis perform, spoken alongside her in classrooms, experiencing firsthand the impact she has on students, and to have served together on the board as WEDU co-chairs. I'd like to thank Alexis for her continued commitment to 3GNY and to speaking to students as often as possible. Please welcome Alexis Fishman.
Thank you so much, Laurie. Hi there, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to share my family story. As Laurie mentioned, and as I'm sure you can hear, I'm Australian. I have lived in New York for most of the last 12 years. I'm the grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors, which in Australia is not all that uncommon, as we're largely a post-Holocaust community with a good smattering of South African Jews thrown in for good measure, who started to immigrate primarily in the 1990s. I just wanted to say hello to all the Australians that are tuning in tonight from Sydney. It's 10 a.m. Thursday morning there, so they can assure you that tomorrow does come. So these are my grandparents. On the left are my father's parents, Berzi and Polly, or Elizabeth and Paul. She was born in a small town called Poroshkov that was then part of Czechoslovakia and is now part of Ukraine. He was born in a town called Vylok that was then part of Hungary and is now also part of Ukraine. On the right are my mother's parents, Elemer and Irenka, or Elemer and Irene. She was born in a small Hungarian town called Mértelek. He was born in a neighboring town just across the Hungarian-Romanian border called Sarasbarek, close to Szatmár. Now, I'm going to tell you a little secret. My mother's parents were first cousins. Her mother and his father were brother and sister. The story goes that when the war ended, my grandmother had met and become engaged to someone else. I've heard him described as a bit of a bad boy. I picture him in a leather jacket, riding a motorcycle, quite a funky picture of my potential future grandfather. But my grandmother wasn't into bad boys, and after that engagement was broken off, her identical twin sister Margaret, who you'll hear a lot more about, suggested she go have a little break and visit her older cousin in Romania. He was 16 years older than her. But it turned out that they were a perfect match, and we know that they were really very much in love because my uncle was born 8 months after their wedding and he was not premature. On the right is a picture of my grandmother together with her twin sister Margaret, taken on their 70th birthday in 1990. Margaret is on the left, my grandmother is on the right. They were so identical, they used to wave at each other from across the street. And as they got closer, they would realize that one of them was waving at her own reflection. They looked exactly the same, but were wildly different in personality. I also wanted to introduce you to my father's aunt, my great aunt Yoli, or Juliana, who is pictured on the left-hand side. She does show up a little later in the story, but I particularly wanted to mention her because today is her yahrzeit. It's 2 years to the day in the Hebrew calendar that she passed away at the age of 94, the last surviving of any of my grandparents' siblings. I had a close relationship with both of them. They were both really remarkably strong women. So unlike many of my 3G friends and colleagues, my grandparents didn't speak publicly about their Holocaust experiences. They never took part in Spielberg's shower tapes, and it was rare that they spoke to us. Both my grandfathers died before I was born, when my parents were young. My mother was just 16 and my father 23. So they didn't have a chance to know their stories at all. So telling this story always seems a little bit fragmented, and I'm going to ask for your understanding of that up front. And a little later, I'm also going to take a few minutes to talk about the impact that my grandparents' legacy has had on my life and my career as an actress. So first, I'm going to speak about my maternal grandparents, Elemer and Irenka, because let's face it, we already have intimate knowledge of them. My grandmother Irenka was born in 1920 in Mértelek, as I mentioned, a small Hungarian village, and she and her identical twin were the youngest of 6 children. They grew up in a one-room house. It was a kosher home with a dirt floor and the house was so small that the dining table would be moved outside in the summertime to make more room. The twins' older brother Zoli taught them how to climb trees and ride bicycles, and with their friends, they would make up dances to perform for whoever would watch. Nearby the house, there were 2 ponds and lots of cousins, and they would swim in the summer and skate in the winter. Relations in the village were really good. The population was about 50% Protestant and 50% Catholic, along with about 5 Jewish families. 3 of them were relatives. My grandmother remembers at Christmas time, people would knock on the door of their house to sing carols, and my great-grandmother would offer them cognac and cake. When my grandmother was 2, her father went in for a relatively simple surgery on an injured leg. He was said to be somewhat of a vain man, and a horse riding accident a number of years before had left him a little bit lame, and he didn't like it. So he went to have it corrected without telling his wife what he was doing, and tragically he died on the operating table, leaving her with 6 young children. Now, because she was a woman and it was 1922, she was unable to keep the license that they had for a small inn with a restaurant on the first floor and boarding rooms above, but she was industrious enough to look after her family and make sure that everyone was taken care of. When my grandmother was about 8 years old, a famous priest from Debrecen, a much larger Hungarian town, was making a goodwill visit throughout the countryside, visiting all the towns and villages. The twins, and you can see them there in the middle, they were attending a Protestant primary school at the time, and the entire village made a very big welcome for this priest. The 2nd grade class, about 40 students, had prepared a singing program. Out of all the 40 children, the priest, His Excellency Dr. Balthazar Dejo, and I mention his name because he was actually very esteemed amongst the Jews of Hungary for his stance against anti-Semitism. There's a New York Times article that I recently came across from 1925 that reports him visiting and speaking at the synagogue of the First Hungarian congregation in New York. So among all the children that came out to greet him, Dr. Dejo noticed the identical twin girls and asked to meet their father. The twins explained that their father had passed away, so the bishop insisted on meeting their mother, and he asked her about her plans for the girls' future education. Their mother said she couldn't afford to educate them because she had 4 more children to feed and look after, so the bishop offered to take care of their schooling. He explained that he had a good friend in Debrecen called Dr. Slazenger, the first rabbi at Debrecen Great Synagogue, and they could work something out. My great-grandmother asked permission to think about it, and the next day she came to him and told him that her wish was for her eldest son to become an Orthodox rabbi. So instead, it was my great-uncle Shonyi who was educated under the patronage of Dr. Balthazar. My great-uncle Shonyi was a very learned man and actually was the founding rabbi at the Maroubra Synagogue in Sydney, the synagogue that my entire family were members, where my brother was bar mitzvahed and my sister was married. So I guess it was a good decision on the part of my great-grandmother. The years went by and the family was happy and relatively secure. And in the early 1940s, when my grandmother was in her early 20s, her sister Margaret traveled to Budapest, which was just a few hours away, to spend time with her brother Shonyi, and ended up getting happily married to a man who owned a jewelry shop. My grandmother stayed behind to be with her mother, but moved to Budapest a little while later. In the spring of 1944, my great aunt Margit organised for her mother to come have a visit in Budapest. She had a secret plan to rebuild the house in Maitalek while great-grandmother was away, and have it ready for Passover, when all the family would gather together in the new home to celebrate. One afternoon during this visit, they were out having tea with relatives in Budapest, and when it was time to leave, they were stunned to walk outside to find that Nazi tanks had taken over the streets. Great-grandmother rightfully got nervous and immediately wanted to get back home. Her eldest daughter and children had moved in with her after her husband had been sent to a Hungarian labour camp. So my aunt arranged for her to get on the next train back to Maitalek. But my aunt noticed something suspicious, and she somehow realised that the train wasn't going to the right place or in the right direction. It had too many soldiers. Something wasn't right, and she managed somehow to physically get great-grandmother off the train. My aunt then took her mother back to her flat, but great-grandmother was so distraught about wanting to get back to her daughter and grandkids that Auntie Margaret put her on another train the next day that did go back to Maitalek. My great aunt was right about the first train. That train was ultimately taking people to Auschwitz. But Maitalek was in the first region to be deported, and great-grandmother's fate remained the same. My Auntie Margaret once said, "I took her off the train to Auschwitz and then put her on the train to Auschwitz." They never gathered together in the new house that Passover. At this point, my grandmother and aunt go into hiding in Budapest as Christians with false papers. Their brother Sonyi was working in the Jewish underground with Hanoar Hatzioni, a Zionist youth movement, and he was helping to forge documents and take care of fugitives from forced labor camps. The twins dyed their hair blonde, learned the Lord's Prayer, and lived on opposite sides of the city so as not to draw attention to themselves. My grandmother's new identity was Ilona Adamko and my aunt Erzsébet Zsomor. They lived like this for 9 months. By the time Budapest was liberated in early 1945, my great-grandmother, 2 of my grandmother's older siblings, and their small children had all been murdered in Auschwitz. My uncle and mother were both born in Sotmar in Romania, 15 months apart. My mother doesn't know her real birthday. We'd always celebrated on January 12th, but relatively recently, she discovered that she was actually born at the end of December. See, back then in Europe, your age was noted by the year of your birth. So you wouldn't say, I'm 50, you'd say, I'm in 1970. My mother's uncle, who had been tasked with going to register my mother's birth, thought it would be better for my mother, being a woman, to be a 48, not a 47. So he registered her birth on the day that he got to the registry, not on the day that she was actually born. By the time my mother found this out, anyone that would have remembered the exact day that she was born had long since passed away. The family got exit papers to Israel and lived there happily on a farm in Migdal Ashkelon, which is close to the Mediterranean, just north of Gaza. My mother has lots of happy memories with the animals on the farm and also some unhappy ones. Apparently there were some pretty aggressive geese. The rest of the family was in Australia and they were all putting pressure on my grandparents to join them. My grandfather didn't particularly want to. He was happy in Israel, but he ultimately caved into family pressure and they arrived in Sydney on January 1st, 1956. My grandfather passed away on my grandmother's birthday in 1964, 8 years later when my mother was just 16. My grandmother passed in 1993 at the age of 73 when I was just 10. The picture on the left is me in front, sitting on my Auntie Margaret's lap, my grandmother behind with my cousins Jakey, Dave, Adam and Michelle. My great aunt Margit in the photo on the right was truly the family matriarch, and if we had the time I could give a whole talk just about her. She died 21 years after her twin in 2014 at the age of 94. Her nieces, nephews, grandnieces and nephews, and great-grandnieces and nephews now number more than 50 and counting. So that is my mother's family. My father's mother, Elizabeth Berzi, was the 4th of 6 sisters, 5 of whom survived Auschwitz. They lived in a small town called Poroshkov, which was then part of Czechoslovakia, today part of the Ukraine. It was a pretty small town, and my great-grandparents were merchants. They owned a small store, sort of like a New York City bodega that sold groceries, hardware, household items. The picture on the left is my great-grandparents, Charlotte and Maximilian Weinberger, and on the right is my grandmother and her youngest sister, Alice, standing alongside their father in front of the store. If you look closely, you can see their family name, Weinberger, written above. My nana was 21 when the Nazis invaded her town. At that time, she was living with her parents and her 3 younger sisters. That's my grandmother on the left. Her 2 eldest sisters were married with children already. One of them had moved to a different town quite a distance away. She's the one sister that didn't survive, and we still don't know what happened to her. The Germans didn't invade that part of Europe until 1944, relatively late into the war. When they did invade, all the Jews in Poroshkov were sent to a ghetto that was in Usharot, a slightly larger town about 1 hour away. They were there for about 3 months before they were transported by cattle car to Auschwitz. The journey took 3 days. 3 days of no food, no water, no toilet facilities, and no way to sit down. When the doors finally opened, they were met by fellow prisoners in striped uniforms. They were separated from their parents and anyone else who was deemed too old or unfit to work. Their heads were shaved, they were stripped of their clothes and belongings and given a grey cloth dress and wooden shoes. That day, my great-grandparents were murdered in Auschwitz. So were the small children of my great-aunt Motzi, my grandmother's oldest sister. I don't have too many details of my grandmother's time at Auschwitz. In my experience, there are survivors who find sharing their stories gives them some sense of purpose or catharsis, and there are others that just simply cannot talk about it. My grandmother was an example of the latter. When she did talk about her Holocaust experience, it was in snippets of very strong memory, but there was a distance to it, a sense that you could never really engage with her on it. It felt as though she was overcome by a desperate need to get a particular memory off her chest in that moment, and there was never much invitation for discussion. I remember as a kid, it was scary. It was scary to hear her stories because they were horrific, but also because I absolutely hated hearing her upset. I knew she had nightmares and trouble sleeping. While it was rare for her to talk, the one thing that she said over and over again was even if you spent just half an hour in Auschwitz and then lived a life of total luxury, you would never ever forget. As I got older, I started to realize that my time with her was limited, so I didn't shy away as much from asking her questions. One day when I was visiting her with my sister and my niece, who at the time was about 2, she started talking about her experiences at Auschwitz, and I happened to have a camera on me, so I videoed her.
When they were killing the people,
the gas chambers.
Oh
my God.
And I've heard the children crying in every language. I want to go home. Where is my mommy? Where is my daddy? Where is my mommy? Where is my daddy? I want to go home. I want to go. In every language, in Polish, in Czech, in Hungarian, in German, in Russian. It was just something unbelievable. And to sleep like this, you can't. There was on one, the tin on the top and tin downstairs. You couldn't,
in bunks, like in
couldn't move.
Yeah.
Couldn't move. There was no sleeping. And to listen to all that.
That's
And before they cried, the old ones, but they died soon, much sooner than the children. Oh yes, the children. It was very hard. Very hard. They did it during the night.
They would do it in the middle of the night.
Yes.
So this is what you'd hear in the middle of the night.
Mommy.
Yeah.
My mother was holding my hand and she said to me, she saw that they separated us. She said, this is the last time I'm seeing you.
She knew what exactly.
Yeah, she saw the whole thing. And she wasn't an old woman, she was 44.
Nana, were you in a ghetto before?
Yeah.
You were in a ghetto before the camp?
In a ghetto.
For how long? In Ghent? Not where?
3 months.
Where?
3 months in a ghetto. But at least you could have... We took all the best outfits with us to the ghetto because we saw that this is something extraordinary. So we took the best, and there at least we were dressed.
You were human beings at least there.
Sorry?
You were human beings at least.
Yeah, at least, yes. And the food, very little food. Very little, but it was better than Auschwitz.
And what did you think when they took you to the ghetto?
We did nothing. We didn't know one thing. Only when they took us when they, what do you call this?
The cars, the rail cars.
Yes, and then they take the horses and the animals.
No.
In days.
Yeah, cattle cars. In a minute, later.
So the irony is not lost on me seeing my beautiful niece chatting and playing while my grandmother speaks of children dying in the gas chambers. When it was clear that the Nazis were losing the war, they evacuated all the prisoners of Auschwitz on foot in what later became known as the Death March. German soldiers would shoot anyone that fell behind or couldn't continue to walk. My great-aunt Yoli, whose picture you saw earlier, almost didn't make it. She decided she couldn't go any further and she sat down in the snow. She recalls waiting until her sisters had walked far enough ahead of her so they wouldn't see her get shot. Squeezing her eyes tightly closed, waiting for the inevitable, she heard the voice of a German soldier behind her. "Girl, get up. It won't be long now." My grandmother spoke about the joy of being liberated by the Russians while on the march. Her eyes lit up when she spoke of it. She remembers vividly a Russian soldier who she said was so nice, asking her why she was naked, that he took a dress off a dead girl's body that was lying near her on the ground and gave it to her to wear. She spoke of tables of food that the Russians had set up, but that they rightly advised her not to eat too much because her stomach wouldn't be able to handle it. She was so grateful for their kindness and so proud that she was one of the few girls who could speak to the soldiers in Russian. After the war, my grandmother spent a short time in a displaced persons camp where she recalls the Russian soldiers taking them out to coffee houses. After a time, she and her sisters travelled back home to Czechoslovakia to see if any surviving relatives had made it back too, but there was no one there. So they left again and started travelling west, because at that point it wasn't safe for them to stay in their hometown either. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. My grandmother met my grandfather Paul in a town called Cheb on the German-Czech border where they got married. He had survived a Hungarian labour camp. His little brother Ziggy, then about 12, had been murdered in Auschwitz along with his mother. My father, an only child, was born in Cheb in 1947, just 2.5 years after my grandmother left Auschwitz. My grandparents left for Israel and lived in Zichron Yaakov near Haifa for 3 years before immigrating to Australia in 1951. My auntie Yoli was already in Australia and helped to sponsor their visas. When they arrived in Australia, they lived in a small apartment and they worked hard. My grandfather as a builder's labourer and my grandmother in a hosiery factory. My father remembers at age 6 sitting on the doorstep for hours after school, waiting for them to come home from work. My aunt Alice, who you saw in that first picture, standing with my grandmother outside the shop, lived with them, and she and my father shared a bed until she got married when he was 12. So speaking of Auntie Alice's wedding, this is a picture from 1956. The woman in the middle is my Aunt Motzi, the eldest of the 6 sisters. To the left is my grandmother. As I mentioned, before the war, Aunt Motzi had a husband and 2 young children who were murdered in Auschwitz. After the war, she moved to the United States, remarried and had a daughter, my dad's first cousin Susan, who remembers as a child her mother would take her to playgrounds where they lived looking for children, with just a sliver of hope that maybe somehow hers had survived and might be living in Western Pennsylvania. So this picture is the first time that the sisters had been together since leaving Europe. Motzi had come to attend Alice's wedding. Alice is pictured on the far right. The picture was actually taken from an Australian newspaper, and accompanying it was an article with the headline, "Parents Died in Furnace." My grandfather died in 1970 when my father was just 23. This is a picture of them together, very soon before he died, and anyone who knows my father will immediately see the resemblance. You know that game that people sometimes play where they ask you if you could invite anyone in the world to a dinner party, dead or alive, celebrity, fictional character, anyone? So the first person on my list is always my papa. According to those who knew him, he was really special. Charming, dashing, warm, handsome. My grandmother wasn't the easiest of women, and he really looked after her. I wish I could have known him. My grandmother passed away in 2013, leaving behind 3 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. She received reparations from the German government every month, but said that even if they paid her $1 million, it wouldn't be enough. And anyway, she said, I don't need their money. They can get lost. What was unfathomable to me was how someone who had witnessed and experienced the trauma and horrors that she did could still live, could build a life for herself, have a husband, a family, go to work and laugh and go on vacation. The lesson that it's taught me is whatever is going on in my life, I can survive it. I can get through. My grandmother struggled with the memories of her trauma her whole life, but she loved cruising. She loved singing along to the radio, and she loved her high heels. She wore them until she was 90 years old. She had a beautiful fashion sense, and I wear her monogrammed mink coat in New York City winter with pride, although I know it's not at all PC to wear fur anymore. I'm an actor and a singer, and a number of years ago, I wrote a show that was born out of a deep desire to bring myself closer to my grandparents' experiences. It's called Club Gelberstern, and it explores the someone that I might have been if I had lived in Europe in the 1930s. Set in Berlin in 1933, it tells the story of a Jewish cabaret star who was performing her final night on stage as the Nazis take power. We did the show a number of years ago at the New York Music Theatre Festival. And each night before the curtain went up, I would think about my grandmother Berzi, who had passed away just the year before. I wondered what she would have thought of my performance. I wondered if maybe, just maybe, my creation of this piece of art might have been able to alleviate some of her pain, to make up for some of her suffering. My immediate second thought was how silly that was. Nothing positive, ever, could have come from what she and my grandparents went through during the war. But I did imagine telling her, Nana, this is not what Hitler intended. When he sent you to the camps, he did not for a second think that 70 years later, your proud, strong, free, and fiercely Jewish granddaughter would be on stage in a city with a thriving population, leading an audience in a song that taunted him for being a weak, gutless bastard. And any of you that have seen the show will remember that song well. While my grandparents are at peace, Hitler is rotting in his grave. He failed. And here is the proof. A photo at my engagement party 3 years ago of maybe a quarter of the family that Hitler tried to destroy. And next year, COVID willing, my cousin is hosting a Passover Seder for about 90 people, all of the descendants of the 6 siblings that were never able to meet in the new house in Metalek to celebrate with great-grandmother. When I share this story in schools, I often ask the students who they think is responsible for the Holocaust. And of course, the first answers are usually Hitler, the Nazis, Germany, and we eventually come to so-called innocent bystanders or ordinary citizens. And thinking about that reminds me of a quote that I once read by a British journalist who was covering the horrors of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is widely acknowledged by historians as the night the Holocaust began. It was November 9th, 1938, a day after Herschel Greenspan, a young Polish Jewish refugee who was born stateless in Germany, had received word that his parents had been expelled from Hanover and in retaliation assassinated a diplomat at the German embassy in Paris. Back in Germany, with Herschel cast as the perfect scapegoat, a night of terror ensued, and on November 10th, the sun came up over streets that were littered with broken glass. 267 synagogues were destroyed, 1,574 damaged. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated. 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized or destroyed completely. 100 Jews were killed as a direct result of the attack between November 9th and 10th, but many of those arrested on this night would later die in concentration camps. On Kristallnacht, firefighters were so scared of being beaten up for saving Jewish property that they had to stand idly by as they watched synagogues burn to the ground, only putting water onto the flames when the fire began to blacken the edges of the non-Jewish property next door. So the quote from British journalist Hugh Carlton Green of the Daily Telegraph was this: "I have seen several anti-Jewish outbreaks in Germany during the last 5 years, but never anything as nauseating as this. Racial hatred and hysteria seem to have taken complete hold of otherwise decent people. I saw fashionably dressed women clapping their hands and screaming with glee, while respectable middle-class mothers held up their babies to see the fun." So just like a pothole that seems to suddenly swallow a car, the violence that erupted on Kristallnacht also seemed sudden, but was foreshadowed by a million tiny cracks in the pavement that went unnoticed or were ignored. The man who told an innocent Jewish joke at the dinner table. The boy advised by his parents that it would be better if he no longer played with his Jewish neighbour. The Jewish-owned department stores tacitly blamed for the closure of smaller stores, and ultimately the Nuremberg laws that severely restricted Jewish freedom in Germany, all of which occurred in full view of the average person who turned a blind eye. By the time Kristallnacht occurred, it was well and truly too late to stop what would lead to the death of 6 million Jews and so many others. So when I talk with students, we talk about ways to step in early and often, wherever small injustices are found, on the playground, in the classroom, on the street, because that is the easiest and most effective time to act. By the time Nazi tanks have taken over the streets, it's too late. So my hope, aside from finding a COVID vaccine already so that our Passover family reunion can happen next year, is that all of us can continue to fight even the smallest of injustices, as we see them, wherever we see them, against whomever we see them. Let us be beacons of light that shine brightly wherever there is discrimination, intolerance, and bullying, even as our own community continues to be its target. Let us stand tall and fight against hatred, fear, and most importantly, indifference. Thank you all so much for tuning in tonight.
Alexis, such an amazing job. Thank you so much for gifting us with your family stories. I'm sure all of your grandparents would be so proud of you. We are now going to open it up for Q&As. Please type questions into the Q&A tab, chat feature on the bottom. And if you have a question for Alexis, we'll prioritize that, and any other questions about the organization, you can always email them to us at info@3gnewyork.org, and we'll respond there. Okay, there's a question. Someone would like to hear more about Rabbi Schlesinger. And on that.
That is a good one. I have to say, I unfortunately cannot help with that. I don't know much about Rabbi Schlesinger. The priest, there's quite a lot of information about, but I have not looked up Rabbi Schlesinger, so feel free to do that.
What has been the reaction when you tell your family stories in schools?
Look, what's amazing is that, you know, you're often standing in front of a classroom of kids that are nothing like you. You know, it's rare that we speak to Jewish students. They're often, you know, kids of different racial backgrounds, economic backgrounds, social backgrounds, everything. And I give credit to the teachers who I think for the most part really prep their students well. But in the classrooms that I've been in, you can really hear a pin drop. It's just that it's amazing. They're always really respectful and interested. I think that that's the brilliance of the WEDU program, is that, you know, rather than learning something from a textbook, you get to learn it from a live person, and not just a live person, but someone that, you know, has a direct connection with someone that experienced it. So it's always been an amazing experience.
Did your grandmother ever talk about what it was to lose her twin sister? Alana asked, she said that her grandmother is 94 and lost her identical twin almost 20 years ago.
Look, I personally didn't have any, she never spoke to me about what it was like to not have Nana around anymore. But, you know, my mother or her daughters might be able to speak differently to that. They were really close. I mean, I remember when my grandmother was dying, we had brought her home to her house for the last few days of her life. And any time that my aunt touched her, she was in a coma, she wasn't responsive, but anytime that my aunt, her twin, touched her, she would sort of rally harder. Her breath would get, you know, more labors, though she was trying to kind of communicate or who knows what. So, look, they had a very close bond, but I can only imagine that for my aunt, it would have been really sad to have lived for 20 years without a sister.
So, great question. How did your grandparents' experience inform your daily behavior and thoughts when going about your day?
Oh, look, I as I said, I mean, I have I think what is a healthy outlook. I mean, particularly, let's say with COVID, it's like, you know, you can't help but think, well, listen, my grandparents went through worse. So I think that's kind of a daily, you know, thought in my head. But what's been interesting to me is, as an artist, you know, my Jewishness, but the Holocaust particularly, has been, you know, somewhat of an obsession almost. You know, it's come through a lot of my art, which I think is interesting and unexpected. I wouldn't have expected that.
Have you ever been back to any of your grandparents' hometowns?
I have not, although a few years ago, I was in Poland and Ukraine with my husband. We were shooting a Holocaust documentary. And I realized while I was on that trip that we were actually really, really close to my grandparents' hometowns. We didn't get a chance to visit because it was like a 6-day shoot and it was jam-packed. But I only recently realized that they actually, all 4 of those towns are actually in like a 3-hour radius. They're really, really close to each other. So I hope to get there soon and do a trip and see all 4 of the towns, you know, in one trip.
That would be amazing. How can someone is asking, how can I instill the importance of telling their story to my grandchildren?
Oh gosh, we'll get them to come to 3GNY when we've, you know, we'll have happy hours and we do all sorts of awesome, fun things. So that's the first thing. Look, I don't know. I'm not sure that, to be honest, it's probably not the answer that you want to hear, but you know, I don't know whether you can instill that. I don't, you know, I think everyone's different, and some people don't necessarily feel a connection to their family histories, whatever it is. So, you know, I don't know, but I think send them to 3GNY, and even if you're not in New York, just to send them to our website and have a look at what we do and get involved. That's what I'd suggest.
I'll second that. How do you, actually a lot of people, I just want to say, are wondering how they can see you perform and if you will be reviving your show.
Oh, that's so nice. I hope so. Let's get that vaccine going on. I have a website, www.alexisfishman.com. That's the best way to keep up with what I'm doing. And you can also join my mailing list there, so you can be the first to know of upcoming things. I definitely want to do that show again. It was originally done in 2011, so it's almost 10 years old, and it just continues to have a life. It just continues to, you know, it continues to be relevant, sadly. And, you know, from an artistic perspective, it remains incredibly valuable to me as an artist. So I love performing it. So hopefully that particular show will come around again. What else we got, Laurie? People are shy? Oh, there's lots of comments.
Hi. So someone asked, how do you see the U.S. now in what you shared? I'm sorry, how did you see the U.S. now and what you just shared now in your story?
Politics. Someone wants to go with politics. No. Look, I mean, without wading into politics, I won't do that. But, you know, I don't think you can compare what happened in Nazi Germany, or at least you can't compare the Holocaust to what's happening now. So you know, again, politics aside, I react badly to that comparison. You know, until there are people being shipped off to concentration camps, I don't think it's a fair comparison. Having said that, I think that there's a lot of speaking up to be done, and that is on both sides of the aisle. And I think people, you know, are often too scared or, you know, feel unable to stand up for the injustices that they're seeing. So I do absolutely believe that we are in a crucial time, as always, where it's important to not be scared to share your voice and to speak out about injustice wherever you see it.
Great question. How did your grandparents experience Australia in the early years?
That's my cousin Ruthie. Hi, Ruthie. I'm actually seeing a lot of family members. Hi, Mum. Hi, Ricardo. Hi, Joe. What was the question, Ruth? Oh, here, I've got it written. How did your grandparents experience Australia in the early years? You know, I don't know. Maybe Ruth could speak to that a bit better. I mean, I do remember, or recently I sort of went to the suburb that my father had grown up in, Maroubra, for those of you in Sydney. And I hadn't really spent much time there at all, but he did a little tour with me of sort of his first apartment and where they first settled. And I remember thinking, like, my gosh, this is like, how far away from Eastern Europe can this place look? Like, that just must have been so strange and confusing and weird and amazing. I mean, my grandmother, I'm talking about my father's mother at least now, you know, spoke with such pride about Australia, that Australia was the greatest place on earth, and she was so lucky to be there, and I agree. You know, but I don't know. I don't know what the details particularly of their experiences. I think they were just focused on working hard and trying to provide and you know, focusing on the positive.
Were they surrounded by a lot of survivors in Australia? No.
Yeah. So as I said, Sydney's a largely post-Holocaust community, meaning that until sort of South Africans began to really immigrate in the 1990s, you know, it was almost entirely, like, it was rare for me as a kid to meet someone whose grandparents were not Holocaust survivors. You know, I went to Jewish day school, and most people were grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, which is very different to the US. So yeah, they did. There was big survivor communities, and I think that's, you know, along with their relatives and their cousins and their family, that's who they were hanging out with and who they were surrounded by.
Oh, we still have questions coming in. How would you involve the second generation Holocaust survivors to help tell your story?
That's Mummy. Hi, Mum.
Oh.
Yeah, Rosalie. Hi, Mum. Good question, Mum. Well, to be totally honest, at 3GNY, we tend to be a little bit protective of our identity as the third generation. And there's a few reasons for that, but I think that one of them is that I think we tend to feel as though grandchildren have a pretty different perspective to children of survivors. We're that one extra generation removed. We are often less traumatized and just have that kind of unique special relationship with our grandparents that allowed sort of for the transmission of memory in a way that that is unique and special. So from an organizational perspective, I'm not sure. We do some, we do have some kind of some overlap in some events, I think, that involve 2G. But generally, we kind of are quite sort of proud of our identity as grandchildren. So I'm not sure that we're really kind of looking to do that. I think sort of the whole point of 3GNY is for the grandchildren to kind of take that mantle on. Not to say that the second generation, of course, doesn't have the right and the reason to be talking about their parents. Of course they do. But I think also it helps with students because, the students are seeing someone that's a little bit closer to their age, so they can relate to that. So yeah, that's, I think, how was that, Mum? Is that good?
If it's okay, I just want to jump in on that point, your mother's questions, because it's a good question. You're right, Alexis, we are very protective of wanting to have a place for grandkids, and grandkids do have, the different, can ask questions of the grandparents that maybe the kids couldn't ask. But second generations can help a lot in many other ways. As someone who spoke also in Jewish schools, there's a lot of Jewish kids who don't know really about the Holocaust. And there's a lot of Jewish kids in America who their grandparents, they lived in America for hundreds of years. They don't have that personal connection. And I think the second generations can do a good job. They know their kids and make an effort to make sure the kids know much more. And they can also help with donations and outreach to schools in other ways where they have more experience and more life experience to help organizations and younger 3 and 4Gs, grow and get more involved. So that's a place that can help a lot.
I think that's a great point. Donations, money. I'm kidding.
So last question, did you talk about the Holocaust with young friends, comparing families and relating about your experience as a 3G?
That is a good question. No, I don't recall that. I don't recall that as a young person. I mean, I went to Jewish day school. So, the Holocaust was something that was sort of, always in my consciousness. But I don't recall really speaking about it with my friends. I remember a close friend of mine whose grandparents were also Hungarian. We'd sort of make fun of the accent and we'd enjoy the Hungarian food at the Hungarian restaurant in Sydney. But I don't really recall that. And I think because, I think when you're in high school, you're still kind of, you're still sort of too young to engage in that way. And I will say that a lot of my close friends are South Africans, so they don't have that same history. But it is interesting, and I just noticed that there was a question in the chat about my husband being asking if he was a 3G. He's a 2G actually. His father survived 4 camps. His mother was a baby that had escaped out of Poland. And his father actually sadly just passed away relatively recently. But it's interesting because, I had dated a bunch of guys before we met, and American guys, and I was amazed at when he and I met, the connection that we had, because of that shared history. It wasn't something, I always sort of knew that I wanted to marry a Jewish man, but I didn't ever put that added sort of criteria on it, and never would have, but was amazed at how much sort of connection we have over that shared history. It really is, a big connection point for us.
You finally just actually let people know how 3GNY trains speakers, since you were one of the
Yeah, sure,
people.
gladly. We have been working with an amazing educator, Peter Nelson, for many, many years, who was the former executive director of Facing History and Ourselves, an organization based here in New York, or maybe they're actually might be national, maybe they're based in New York, but they do incredible, they're an educational nonprofit that does incredible work in educating teachers and students about genocide. So Peter has been our trainer, and he's terrific. And we have we train over a 4 weeks of, you know, a weekday evening, a few hours each night. And the first session is kind of coming together and talking about sort of story structure and some of those things. And then people come in with a small little bit of their story, which they share and get feedback on. And then come in with sort of, you know, at the end, kind of the full presentation that they share for feedback as well. And it's a wonderful, you know, I think the thing that is, aside from the WEDU program, the thing that makes 3GNY special is that it allows people to connect, and it allows us a forum whereby we all come from the same backgrounds and we're able to kind of, you know, share that community together. So I think that's one of the nice parts of the WEDU training as well, is that people get together and do what I was just asked, share those stories with peers, you know, and everyone's always really moved and really interested, and it's amazing. Any more, Laurie, or are we done?
There's more, but we're gonna have to wrap it up.
I want to answer one more quick question. Somebody asked about 4Gs, Melissa Berman. It's something that we're discussing, and something that we're going to have to get focused on, and because they know even less. So I feel like it's we're not doing it now, but it's something that's only now they're getting older, and we are going to focus on eventually, hopefully. So I just wanted to answer that question.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks, Alexis, and everyone for all of your questions. We'll try to follow up and answer some more about the organization and everything. Feel free to email us. I'm going to turn it to Dylan.
And also, just to finish up, it will be recorded. There are a few people that are asking that question. It is going to be recorded, and it'll go out, I think, in our thank you mailing tomorrow. So feel free to share that.
So first of all, Alexis, wow. I wanted to thank you for speaking tonight and sharing the very powerful story. I think we were all very moved. Thanks again for all the viewers, wherever you're located around the world. We're very happy that you joined us to hear Alexis, and I'm sure you're not going to forget this story. Personally, as someone who spoke at over 25 classes in 12 different schools, I can personally tell you how little kids in America know about the Holocaust. I've been in situations where almost no one in the class knew anything, and it's pretty shocking. So if you haven't made a gift yet, we hope you'll consider making one and supporting us, because the works that we do, and you know, Alexis did when she went to schools, and all of us, is very, very crucial. There are other ways you can greatly help us besides money. Like if you have any connection from teachers, educators, schools, principals, who might want our speakers in their classes, please put in touch with them. You know, right now we're in New York, where we helped launch New Jersey, 3G DC and 3G NJ. And if there's any other states or other places that you can help us get going, you can help us with that as well. But our goal is to try to get into as many classes and reach as many kids as possible. So if you have any ideas on how to help us, please reach out. We hope to see you again soon. We have some great virtual events coming up, including WEDU Wednesday every 2 weeks. Our next one is on Wednesday, September 16. We'll feature Elise Wolf from 3G NJ. And on September 30th, Emily Greenspan will be sharing her story. We'll be sending out an email tomorrow with the details and registration links for those events, as well as recording of tonight's program. You can also check out our past WEDU Wednesday speakers on 3GNY's YouTube channel. We encourage you to share our work with your friends and family so we can ensure that these stories reach as many people as possible. Thank you so much again for taking the time of the evening to be with us. Have a great night. Laila Tov from Tel Aviv.
Laila Tov.
Good night.